On November 13th, 2017, the podcast Two Nice Jewish Boys released an episode called The Man Who Discovers Planets, about Professor Tzvi Mazeh, a leading astrophysicist. He was a guest researcher at Harvard University, and today he teaches at Tel Aviv University. Apart from astrophysics, Professor Mazeh is a political activist and teaches Talmud, only in Israel. During the interview, Professor Mazeh explained that the universe is expanding at a faster and faster velocity. That means that the distance between galaxies in our universe is increasing, and perhaps one day there might be galaxies we can see today through a telescope that one day we will no longer be able to see whatsoever. And the fear, Professor Mazeh's fear, is that scientists 1 billion years from now will not trust what we see today and will not believe the scientific data gathered today. I'll quote Mazeh, "In 1 billion years, how will the scientists be able to convince themselves that there were other galaxies in the sky because they cannot see them?" End of quote. This idea strikes me as an emblematic problem of our time. Do we spend too much time focused on work of the moment that will be rendered meaningless by generations to come? Simply put, how much of our lives are an exercise in futility? What do our lives mean in the billion-year perspective, in the long view of history? The question of humanity trusting information and wisdom across the long view of history, that dilemma has been answered by Judaism. We pray using ancient texts. We wrap ourselves in ancient religious symbols. We treasure an ancient scroll and wisdom literature from thousands of years ago. Do we reinterpret it for modern application? Sometimes we do. Do we read and cherish and preserve every single word? Absolutely. And the reason we still do is because the rabbis believed that even though the Romans destroyed our holy temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, our God is bigger than a building, and our people could stay dedicated in each generation to the tradition of Abraham and Sarah, to the tradition of Moses standing at Mount Sinai. And so I walk in their tradition, and I try to maintain the long view. Moshe kibel Torah misinai, umesara liYoshua, v'Yoshua lizkenim, uzkenim linevi'im, unevi'im misuraha, le'anshei Knesset HaGedolah. In the Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, the wisdom of our ancestors begins by explaining the tradition of the long view. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua transmitted it to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the great assembly. Each day, when I study the Jewish tradition, I walk with Moses and Joshua and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. If I keep the long view perspective, then each of my days, each of my breaths cannot be exhausted on the news of the moment. My attention cannot be distracted by a tweet. I cannot become momentarily hysterical. And yet, I fear that the secular hysteria of this moment in time has caused many of us to lose sight of the larger issues we face as a Jewish people. I fear that some of us aren't aware of some of the Jewish storylines of the past year because we're so distracted. At a time when we walk around with all of the news information of each and every day in our pocket, on our cell phone. We know that, unfortunately, we experience the media in a silo effect. We only see stories that we've already expressed interest in seeing. So if you watch MSNBC, you see the world one way. If you watch Fox News, you see a totally different world. If you only search trips to Maui, Google will not advertise low fares to Tel Aviv on your computer screen. And so it matters now more than ever what you're looking at. So since you've expressed interest in the Jewish tradition by being here this morning, I'd like to take a moment to review some of the stories since we all last sat here together 1 year ago. Stories that I think will have great impact on the Jewish people moving forward here in Israel and around the world. I'll begin locally and bring your attention to the fact that Nazis are running for office here in California. Across the United States, of the 9 candidates who are identified as Nazis or proud white supremacists, 2 are here in California. On July 15th, Haaretz ran an article titled, "Record-breaking number of neo-Nazis and white nationalists running for office in the US." How many of us knew this was even happening? You'll notice that these news stories are being covered by Haaretz and Jerusalem Post for a reason. I believe it's because they are the publications for the Jewish state concerned with issues that face the Jewish people. Speaking of Israel, destructive kites lit on fire and actual rockets have been launched from Gaza all summer long, targeting Jewish communities, kibbutzim, and schools all throughout southern Israel. On August 9th, the Jerusalem Post reported that over 150 rockets were fired that night from Gaza. On the northeast border, Israel's engaged in a battle in Syria with Iran. On July 24th, the Jerusalem Post reported that the Israeli Air Force shot down a Syrian fighter jet over the Golan Heights in Israeli territory. It was the first Syrian jet shot down by Israel since 2014. And the reason why it's so important you follow these stories as they develop is because they're not going to enter your mainstream news media feeds until Israel decides to respond. And then from that point forward, Israel will look like the aggressor. And that's a story that the news media knows that people will watch, without the previous context of all of the articles I'm mentioning from the summer. And Israel depends on ambassadors, Jews and others around the world, who can help give context, who can say no. This conflict didn't start at the moment that MSNBC or the LA Times started granting coverage. And in spite of Israel's challenges on its northern border, this summer, the United States and England asked Israel to rescue Syrians. As the New Yorker reported on July 23rd in an article titled, "The White Helmets, Syria's Noble Rescuers Have to be Rescued by Israel," the story reports, and I quote, "A collection of bakers, tailors, engineers, pharmacists, painters, carpenters, and students nicknamed for their protective hats. They have saved more than 100,000 people in Syria's vicious civil war. Over the weekend, the White Helmets themselves had to be rescued." I'll skip ahead in the article. After appeals from the Trump administration, the Europeans, and Canada, the Israeli government agreed to evacuate the White Helmets and transfer them to Jordan. End of quote. The article goes on to explain that the rescue became complicated when ISIS arrived, but the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, managed to adapt and save the White Helmets. In their own statement, the White Helmets did not thank or even mention Israel or the Israel Defense Forces, France has also refused to acknowledge Israel's involvement in helping them. How many of us even knew that Israel did this? Too often, Israel is held to a higher standard than other countries. Israel is expected to deal with those attacking her with far greater restraint than other countries. And sometimes it fails to express compassion for those killing her children, our children. So we have to remember that Israel is also asked time and again to help those who don't even recognize her, who perhaps hate her. And she, in fact, does it and saves them. Israel's ever-changing foreign relations is becoming more complicated by the day. While its relationships in Europe are strained, how many of us realize that Chinese investment may soon eclipse American investment in the state of Israel? This was reported in the Jerusalem Post on December 20th, 2017. What does it mean for the Jewish state when its largest investor doesn't necessarily share our same values of liberalism or democracy? On April 2nd, 2018, the Times of Israel printed an article that I thought would have shaken the world, titled, "Saudi Crown Prince Recognizes Israel's Right to Exist, Talks Up Future Ties." I didn't hear anybody even acknowledge it. Then the Saudi national television company, Al Arabiya, produced a two-part documentary called The Nakba. As reported in the Jerusalem Post on July 17th, the Saudi series presented the dire situation of European Jewry following the true events of the Shoah, and it explained the true events surrounding the War of Independence in 1948 using phrases in the documentary, and I'm going to quote, "Arab neighboring armies invaded Palestine following the partition plan," and I'm going to quote, "Israel was born and the dream became a reality," end of quote. Now here I'm going to quote from the article. As a result, many Palestinians have complained that the show is an attempt by Saudi Arabia to normalize the Jewish country, end of quote. At a time when Israel's neighbors seem to be cooperating with her more and more, it seems as though that the Palestinians choose to continue to protest our historical truths, protest the Jewish state, protest the true facts of the Shoah, instead of seeking any kind of constructive dialogue. But believe it or not, the biggest Jewish story of the year for me, in the long view of history, wasn't relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia or Israel and China. It was between Israel and Poland. Decades after the Shoah, and coincidentally, around the time when the vast majority of survivors, prevailers, have passed on, Poland decided to propose a law that would have made illegal the phrases Polish death camp or Polish concentration camp in an effort to distance itself from any blame, because Poland wants you to believe that the Nazis alone exterminated 1.5 million Jews in Poland during the Shoah. Poland doesn't want to acknowledge its involvement in the atrocities, its willing executioners who happily handed over Jews or who actively worked at those Polish death camps. Of course, there were righteous Poles. I'm sorry to say there were too few in number. And Israel reacted to the Polish law. Many Jewish organizations here in the United States reacted as well, but Israel reacted to the Polish law in a remarkable way, because Poland cannot be allowed to distance itself from its own involvement in the extermination of the Jewish people in Europe. And I'm proud to say that Prime Minister Netanyahu, along with many leaders of the different parties across the political spectrum in Israel, all stood up to Poland. The conversations in the Knesset, in Jerusalem, affected the law of Poland. The state of Israel has become so strong, so influential, that it can stand up against the European countries who tried to extinguish the Jewish people. There has been a tectonic shift in power in the world. one level of the promise of a Jewish state protecting the Jewish people, our past, present, and future, all across the world, I'm proud to acknowledge that that promise has been fulfilled. During these conversations, I was particularly impressed with two rising stars in the Israeli Knesset, both women, Tamar Zandberg of the Meretz Party and Ayelet Shaked of the Habayit HaYehudi Party. I've had the pleasure of hearing each of these Jewish leaders and meeting them in person. Zandberg and Shaked could not be more different. Extreme left and extreme right, they are both eloquent, both smart, both powerful, both beautiful, both passionate Jewish leaders. They, along with many other Israeli leaders, asked a simple question: to whom does the telling of the Shoah belong? And perhaps, now that we've had decades to digest and reflect and research the events of the atrocities of the Shoah, we should be asking big questions about Poland and Europe, like to whom do these camps even belong? Should these camps even belong to Poland? And now back to Zandberg and Shaked for a moment. In an era of Me Too, at a time when we search for feminist role models for our daughters, it strikes me as ironic that so many Jewish families in America go to women's marches and accept leaders and role models like Linda Sarsour and Tamika Malroy, who refuse to apologize for their anti-Israel, anti-Semitic beliefs and statements, when we possess amazing, inspiring female leaders inside of our own Jewish family, like Zandberg and Shaked. Why do names like Zandberg and Shaked remain anonymous to the vast majority of Jews around the world? Lack of information or lack of interest in searching out Jewish stories, interest in figures that will in fact affect the unfolding Jewish future? In a year when a conservative Masorti rabbi, Rabbi Dov Hayun, of the same Kehilat Moriah that we supported after the Haifa fires, Rabbi Hayun was detained by the police the day before Tisha B'Av for performing a wedding that the Rabbanut, the official Israeli ultra-Orthodox rabbinate, found problematic. Did we even know? I was proud to sign the conservative movement Masorti petition against the Rabbanut and protest this embarrassment, this abomination of a detainment. Will that petition even matter? I'm not even addressing Rabbi Jonathan Sachs' comments in the Jerusalem Post last week on September 2nd that the rise of the Labor Party in the United Kingdom and the possible rise of Jeremy Corbyn to the position of Prime Minister presents an existential threat to Jewish life in the United Kingdom. I'm not even getting into the absurd, offensive Hebrew Union College ordination speech last spring by Michael Shaban. I'm not going to delve into If Not Now's assault on Jewish summer camp Israel education. This year, I read a great deal about If Not Now and have come to the realization that it is, in fact, a damaging Jewish organization. And my question is, have you read their own materials? Do you take the time to read their own website? I have. It explains, and I'm going to quote, "We do not take a unified stance on BDS, on Zionism, or on the question of statehood," end of quote. I could go on and on about issues in the Jewish world that need our attention. But in an age with such easy access to news and media, we don't even see the stories. We can't focus. I'm not advocating for a withdrawal from American politics. Republican, Democrat, whatever you like, go gesund. But first and foremost, we're Jews. I'm advocating for us to spend more time learning about Jewish stories in the world. Because today's news in the LA Times and the New York Times, as shiny and scintillating as it is not going to profoundly affect the narrative of the long view of our history, our lives, our children's lives, our children's children's lives, like the stories in Haaretz and Jerusalem Post. Trust me, I was 18 years old when President Clinton's scandal broke with Monica Lewinsky. All of us, spent too many hours, years, listening to what comes down to sordid details of a sexual affair. Today, it's too difficult to even keep up with President Trump's scandals of the moment. How do we follow the news? How do we filter all of this in our feed? We have to learn to filter the information we receive and the information we pursue. Filter it between that which is important for our lives and that which is only attractive for the moment. How do I filter the news? I walk with Moshe Rabbeinu and with Rabbi Akiva and my grandparents and my future grandchildren's grandchildren. I imagine the chain of tradition that will stretch out over 1 billion years. And I know they will have questions in terms of what I was looking at, just like the astronomers will. Our grandchildren's grandchildren to the 100th degree will think back and wonder what we were looking at. And do you want the answer to be Stormy Daniels? Or do you want the answer to be Pirkei Avot, the wisdom of our ancestors? I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged by members of this community who want to engage in adult education, like all those who came out on weeknights over the summer to study the Shema with me, or like all those who send their kids to our growing religious school. I'm encouraged by this community in which last Sukkot we studied the State of Israel's Declaration of Independence. So many came to me afterward and told me they had never read it for themselves. In this Sukkot, we will study together the actual text of the recent Israeli nation-state law passed on July 19th. Why do the majority of Israelis support it, while so many are outraged? Why is it controversial? Before we accept others' opinions in the media, shouldn't we read it first for ourselves? In a world with so much information and so many choices, let's not forget to engage with the Jewish news and Israel as much as we should. Yes, immigration is important. So is foreign policy. So is a million other things. But the reason we're here today isn't any of those reasons. It's because we were chosen to receive the Torah and to safeguard the Jewish tradition for generations to come. And with each passing day, I become more concerned that we're enwrapped in a news cycle about the tweet of the hour. We're concerned with resistance of today or policies of today, and I fear that little of it will affect our narrative in the long view of history. Today, when we remember the world coming into being, let's devote ourselves and more of our time this upcoming year to seeking out and following Jewish stories around the world, so that in the event we can no longer see the galaxies of today, we'll always trust that our people stood at Sinai, that we built the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, that our diaspora gave birth to thought and culture, and unfortunately desperation, that our persecution led to our death across the world, even in Polish concentration camps, and that we resurrected our ancient inheritance in our rightful national home, the State of Israel, where all Jews and all streams of Judaism should be welcomed as a source of strength for Judaism and humanity at large. So that when the world can no longer see the galaxies of today, our people can still open the 5 books of Moses, and therein find all of us. And God willing, in those books, they'll also find themselves. Shana Tova.